Unit 1 of this course will explore America's pursuit of overseas empire. That is, the ambition to become an imperial global power and the desire to be in league with other great empires at that time, specifically those great European empires. And this occurs at the end of the 1800s, spilling over into the 20th century. And we'll see that this marks a fundamental change in U.S. foreign policy approach and practice. Now, previous to this period, the United States was primarily focused inward, that is, on domestic issues. We're focused foremost on continental expansion, westward movement, right? But once that was pretty much completed by the end of the 1800s, expansionism still continues, but now overseas. So this is America's first foray into overseas imperialism and colonialism, and we'll witness the acquisition, the annexation of territories like Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, which today is still technically part of the U.S., whether a state or what we could call unincorporated territory, which we'll get into in a second. But it also involved the acquisition and colonization of the Philippines, which is probably the largest example of U.S. Formal colonialism, right? The Philippines. Of course, it's no longer a colony, but it certainly was for roughly half a century. Now, we'll also, as seen in the slide here, we'll also discuss a consequence of this effort, and that is the Philippine-American War. Now, this is a lesser-known war. Some of you may not even have heard of this war, but in fact, it was a very brutal war, and it marks, the first involvement in our nation's history with imperial wars, right? The Philippine-American War, which we'll explore in considerable depth. And we'll also see how the U.S. decides to build its overseas colony once the war ends. Let's remember at this time we have no precedent, no historical precedent, no prior experience, that is, with building colonies. How should we approach it? How should we fashion our own versions of overseas imperialism? Should we emulate the European empire? Should we do it in our own way? Should we try to introduce democracy into this, right? Now, as you know, the title of this course, well, it includes the terms empire and war. And as such, there is this fundamental assumption, presupposition of a historical interconnection between empire and war. Now, if you know anything about the history of war, whether it's World War II, World War I, going back to even Napoleon, going back to even the times of antiquity, right? The Roman Empire, for example. Well, this connection is readily apparent to you. But here's the question. How is this interconnection a perennial theme in the formation of what we could call Asian America, right? And when I talk about that, I'm talking about migration, right? The migratory flow of Asian immigrants to the United States and, subsequent family formation, community building of Asians in America during the 20th century, other issues like identity formation, family formation even. How does war and imperialism figure prominently in those events? Okay, so before I go further, allow me to pose this question. And again, for those astute about U.S. history, right, you probably know the answer to this right away. But here's the question. What part of the world did most of U.S. wars, what part did they take place in? during the 20th century? Okay, and if you answered Asia or the Pacific region, you're absolutely correct. Okay, think about this. I just mentioned the Philippine-American War that occurred from 1899 into the early 1900s. Okay, there's one example. Certainly World War II against the Japanese Empire. We had the Korean War that followed that. And then we have the Vietnam War, which involved Laos and Cambodia. So look at that. Most of our wars were fought in the Pacific region. So this brings us to the question, why Asia? And here's where imperialism and empire looms large. As we will explore and uncover this course, the United States set its sight upon the Pacific region as a, quote, sphere of influence, unquote. There's an important term which we'll explore again in the very near future, a sphere of influence at the turn of the 20th century. And this, it was believed by American policymakers and architects of colonialism and imperialism. This involved the inevitable establishment of colonies and military bases abroad in the Pacific region, many of which still remain there today, by the way. And just as mentioned, this imperial ambition of the Pacific would wield consequences in terms of Asian American history. Okay, and indeed, the United States was not simply seeking to expand military power in the Pacific region. Rather, this ambition encompassed various economic, geostrategic, and political dimensions, all of which we will explore throughout this course, but we'll begin to explore in Unit 1. So, first things first, let's explore some basic definitions here to make sure we're all on the same page. And many of you already know or have an idea what the terms imperialism and colonialism refer to. And I have to say, they're often used interchangeably. That is, they're nearly synonymous in, let's say, more popular discourse, right? But, imperialism, as stated in this slide, that's the ideology and policy whereby a country extends its power over other areas outside its official boundaries. And oftentimes it involves the expropriation, that is to say, taking away, or at the bare minimum, control, right, of land in that colony, resources, natural resources, and certainly economic control, all for the benefit of that invading country. Now, colonialism is the act of occupying, at the very least controlling, that territory outside the country. So, if you notice there, imperialism involves ideology and policy. And then colonialism is the actual act. It's almost imperialism set in motion, right? The actual act of being imperial overseas, and it's operationalized, if you will, in these territories abroad, right? So this brings us to the definition of empire, and as stated, it's a large political body that controls, or at least rules over, territory outside its boundaries. And this territory is usually acquired through a form of conquest, often by war. Okay, not always by war, but in many times in history, it's been through conquest, military conquest. By the way, this is opposed to this notion of commonwealth, as stated in the slide. And commonwealth, again, assumes this free association among, at least in theory, equal countries, right? Think, for example, of the UK, the United Kingdom. It involves also, Scotland and Wales and so forth. This is the term commonwealth, right, as opposed to empire. All right, now there's also some related terms as stated in this slide, and I'll discuss them right now. First of all, militarism. Now, militarism is a foreign policy outlook whereby military intervention, military aggression, right? Military activity in general, or at least the threat of it. It's when all of this is a central doctrine or a central practice of your country's foreign policy. Okay, now, there's numerous examples of this. This is obviously seen during the World Wars, World War II, for example, with the Nazi regime, or the Japanese Empire, right? Very militaristic. Not to mention the Cold War that follows that, the USSR, the Soviet Union, was militaristic. More recent examples might be North Korea. And, for example, think of the military parades, right, that the dictator Kim Jong-un is fond of, right? So the question is militarism central to U.S. foreign policy? And the answer to that is absolutely. Okay? We've been involved, the United States has been involved in countless military interventions throughout the 20th century. Not just the wars I mentioned earlier, but a host of others. Okay? Some of which are outside the purview of this class, right? Now, think about this. Today, roughly speaking, there are about 800 U.S. military bases or installations abroad, outside the United States, right? 800 military installations. And you could find them in over 80 foreign countries today. At least the last I looked this up. Okay, 80 foreign countries. So if anything, this is illustrative of how the United States is militaristic, right? And then you turn around and go, well, is there any bases of foreign countries that are found within the United States, right? And the answer is not really. Okay, there might be a very small installation of this country or that, but you don't see, right, other countries establishing the extent to which the United States has, in this global archipelago, if you will, of military bases abroad. Okay, so as I mentioned, this fact alone is proof positive that the United States is militaristic. Okay, now moving on to the next definition here, settler colonialism. And this is a specific approach to colonialism, and it refers to when settlers from the so-called mother country migrate to that overseas colony, and they begin to populate, and indeed that mother country establishes its sovereignty, while sometimes replacing and displacing native populations. So think, for example, of, the United States itself is a settler colony of England, and so is Canada, right? You see English migrants happening, migration happening during the 1600s, 1700s, and until we declared independence on July 4th, 1776, the U.S. was a colony of the English Empire, and you see a lot of migration of English before July 4th, right? And they would settle the parts of North America and eventually establish sovereignty. And you see, 13 states form in 1776. So this is an example of settler colonialism. Now, not all colonies in world history become settler colonies. Okay, in our discussion, we'll see how Hawaii is certainly a settler colony, and you could probably envision that easily. The Philippines, on the other hand, will not be a settler colony. That is to say, you're not going to see this approach whereby very large number of Americans come over and, take over the Philippines. In fact, there are, roughly 10 million Filipinos living in the Philippines when it becomes annexed by the U.S. So it'll be virtually impossible to displace the native population, right?